How did those two people die?
One fell off a bridge, another one died.
One fell off a bridge? Wouldn't that be an accident?
Aye,
What happened?
fell off a bridge.
Were you there when he fell off the bridge?
Aye.
How'd the other one die?
The other one just died, didn't he? He choked.
On his food? So
No.
basically you threw somebody off a bridge and you choked somebody to death.
Aye.
Christopher Hutcheson wanted a legend before he had earned a name. He watched gangster films in a small flat in Ibrox until the gestures felt natural, and the voices seemed like his own. He copied the cold stares, learned the way men in those movies carried anger, and he dressed the part. Neighbors and later reporters would describe Italian furniture and a personal multi-gym in the living room. He spent on suits that announced themselves, including Versace pieces from the city centre, and he inked his skin with slogans that told their own story. Thug for life on one arm, touch of magic on the other. He liked a crowd and a blonde on his arm. By his early 20s, he had what he wanted most, a reputation that made people look away. In Ibrox and Govan, he was known as a small-time dealer with a large temper, a young man who did not forgive debts and who understood how fear could do the work of money. The first death that would reach a jury began as a debt that would not be forgiven. John Mitchell was 34 and homeless. In mid-September 2001, according to the Crown and to witnesses who later testified, Mitchell was assaulted for hours over what the press would write was a few £100s owed. People who were there spoke about a metal bar that crushed fingers, about hot water poured so a man would not forget who he owed, about rope pulled tight and the threat of a weapon, about stabbing to the leg. It was a pattern in miniature, the way a ruler who needs to be feared will make a point of punishment. When the beating was done, he was forced into a car. The road led south into Lanarkshire. A bridge rose over a quiet stretch near Straven, and there the men stopped. The Crown said Mitchell was pushed from the parapet. The death was treated first as a fall. The post-mortem told a different story, and the fall became a murder. A few days earlier, there had been another assault with the same names. A crossbow had been unboxed and pointed, a bolt loosed into a thigh. At home, a wife borrowed money from a grandmother to save a life that might be taken in a second, and a payment plan was agreed. It did not change the violence that followed. Later that same season, the same men bundled the same debtor into a car and drove him to Duntershire to teach one more lesson. The lesson stopped only when their victim cried out that he was finished. Every man and woman who spoke to police later said a similar thing. Fear was a law in that circle. If Christopher said it, you did it. If he asked, you came. If he beckoned, you looked down. Family sat inside the circle and did not mean safety. Daniel Hutcheson was 22, sometimes reported as 23. He had enlisted as a teenager and served in the Royal Highland Fusiliers. His service took him to Bosnia and to Northern Ireland. He was put out of the army after drug use. He was living in Glasgow and struggling to keep his balance when the call came late in the year. The trial would later fix the window between Tuesday, November 20th, 2001, and Tuesday, December 11th, 2001. The place was the flat on Woodville Street in Ibrox. The man he was going to see was his cousin. The reason, the prosecutors said, was a debt and a grievance that had the shape of blame. Christopher thought Daniel had stolen to pay what he owed, and he also believed that Daniel and his side of the family had a share in the loss of his older brother, Mark, who had died after taking tablets. Whether those beliefs lit the fuse, or only helped Christopher explain himself later, does not change what happened in that room. Andrew Ferguson was 19 then. He called himself a sidekick once, and the papers called him that too. He sat just feet away from Daniel and watched. He told the court he watched because he was afraid, because you could not tell Christopher no. He said he saw his friend tie a rope around Daniel's neck and pull. He said he was made to describe Daniel's face as the rope tightened, to say out loud what fear looks like on a cousin's features, to watch the breath go and the eyes fix. He was asked in court whether it is not evil to sit by and watch an execution. He said evil is in the doing, not in the watching. It was an answer that divided people in the gallery and stayed with the jurors as they listened to what came next. He admitted to what happened after. He said he helped carry a body and he used a saw, and he cut limbs because he was told to do it. He said he did not burn parts in a back court, and he said he did not scatter remains. He claimed coercion. He told the jury he was a young man who did not know how to refuse. The Crown said choice remains even in fear. The judge would later tell the panel that if two men acted together in the killing, it would not matter whose hands closed on the rope. There was a witness whose fear and shame felt familiar in the room. Derek Scanlon was 22, an electrician from Clydebank. He said he was called to the flat on a Sunday toward the end of the year and told a mad story, that a cousin was dead in the bathroom. He said he laughed. He said he did not believe. He said he stuck his head past the jamb and could see a body in the bath. He said Christopher asked him to help lift that body, and he said no. He said he went back the next day, and that he was posted at the end of the street, so that eyes would be on the pavement and ears on the stair. In the days that followed, he said he saw an oil drum in a tenement back garden, and he watched fire burn long and slow. He said the arms and legs were burned on the first and second day. He said on the third day the head went into the drum, bagged in plastic. He said the smell was something that took lodging in the brain. He said he felt numb and ashamed. He said he kept returning out of fear, and that he did not know how to move his feet. He said he watched the ashes poured onto a wooden board, sifted, and bagged into bin sacks. He said he saw a torso wrapped in a tent and carried to a waiting car by Christopher and a cousin named Scott Macaulay. He said a stranger drove that car away. He said what he knew, quietly, and he said what he felt, loudly, that fear can empty a person of will. Cross-examination put sharp questions to that fear and to the choice not to run. He kept to the same answer, that fear is a chain. The Crown said the chain led from the bathroom to a garden and then out across the city. The prosecution told the jury the men had gone shopping after a night in town. They had gone to B&Q and bought a saw, rubber gloves and cable ties, and packages for what they meant to do. That list would be repeated by the judge months later, when he told the jurors that ordinary items can be bought for extraordinary ends. The defense pushed back on detail and sequence, and it took issue with who had done what and when. There was no pushing back on one hard fact that would leave the private circle and move into public sight. On Friday, April 26, 2002, two men out with dogs noticed a bundle on a stretch of water near Old Kilpatrick under the long skyline of the Erskine Bridge. They drew closer, pulled at the plastic, and smelled what they had found. Inside was a torso. They called the police, and the city reeled. It had been 5 months since Daniel had gone missing. Now a discovery on the river pulled a dozen rumors into a single question that detectives could work. Officers followed the riverbanks and dragged wooded edges and slips, looking for what the drum and the hands had turned back into ash, and for what might still be found. The torso had been wrapped in a tent. People saw the forensics tent go up and the vans arrive, and they went home and told their families that something fearful had come to the water. In the weeks that followed, other reports described body parts left at the river's edge and under the bridge. The recovery of the torso was the turning point that let detectives call a murder inquiry and point to a place to begin. Arrests began, and the charge sheets told their own short history. In one hearing at Glasgow Sheriff Court, it was put to an 18-year-old named Andrew Ferguson that he had strangled a man between Friday, November 30th, 2001, and Friday, April 26th, 2002, while acting with another. It was said he had cut up a body, burned a head and limbs, and put a torso into the Clyde near the old Erskine Ferry slip road with the intent to destroy evidence and pervert the course of justice. Another charge said he had abducted a 34-year-old named John Mitchell on Wednesday, September 12th, 2001, tied a rope round his neck, tied him to a chair, struck him with weapons, poured boiling water over his hands, and placed a firearm against his leg, all to his severe injury and danger of life, and that he had later been taken to a bridge near Straven, where he was found dead on Sunday, September 16th. There was a further charge that named a man called David Nicholson, and an attempted murder count for Tuesday, January 8th, 2002. There were counts of drug dealing, assault, and resisting arrest. A few days later, a 22-year-old named Christopher was called before a sheriff as well. He was charged with the murders of Daniel and of John Mitchell, with the cutting up of a body to defeat justice, and with related assaults. A third man named Scott Macaulay was charged with attempting to defeat the ends of justice by helping with the removal of a torso. Both Christopher and Andrew made no plea or declaration and were remanded for further inquiry. When the case came to the High Court in Glasgow in March 2003, the Crown was ready with a simple line and a grim story. The advocate depute, Norman Ritchie, told the jury that the charges were truly horrific, that the two men had acted together, and that they had confessed together. He told the jury about Derek Scanlon's visit to the flat that Sunday. He said Scanlon heard the words, "We murdered Daniel," from Christopher's mouth. He said Andrew was present, heard the claim, and said we did. He said both men took the body to the bath to make sure the deed was done. He said both men took steps to remove and to hide. He said the confession was joint, and that the acts were joint, that the law would look at common purpose, and would not be measured by which hand pulled a rope in a small room. He told the panel they would hear about a hardware store run for a saw and for bags and ties. He told them they would hear about a drum in a back court and an oil fire that burned over days. He told them they would hear about ashes emptied and bagged. He told them they would hear about a torso wrapped in a tent and carried to a car. He told them they would hear about the Clyde and a slip road and a bridge. He told them they would hear about another man who was held for hours and then taken in a car and pushed from the parapet of a bridge in Lanarkshire. He said both cases had a single rhythm, a debt and a punishment, then a disposal. The defense called witnesses and put its own questions. Andrew repeated that he had been forced and that he was the younger man, that fear and the presence of a dominant friend had left him with no choice. He said he had used the saw because he had been told to use it. He said he did not carry ashes and did not feed a drum and did not scatter remains. He said he had not thrown a man from a bridge. He was pressed on what he had watched and on what he could have done. He gave the answer he had given the prosecutor, that evil was in the doing and that he had not had the will to act. Derek kept to his account of the bathroom and the fire and the lookout on the street. The crossbow victim and his wife spoke about a night when a small crossbow was pulled from a bag, about a bolt fired into a leg and the fear that made a grown man weep, and about a trip to a grandmother for money to make the pain stop. An electrician spoke about the look on a man's face when pressed to the edge. The Crown built its case with these human accounts and with a scene on a riverbank. Some witnesses described grotesque boasts they had heard. They spoke about a head treated like a toy and of words tossed about rooms so that people would know who was king. Those claims were testimony, not findings of science. The court heard them because they were the words that people said had been said. When the words and the exhibits were done, the judge set the law in front of the 12. He said acting together would be enough. He reminded them of the date window fixed by the Crown for Daniel's killing in the Ibrox flat, between Tuesday, November 20th and Tuesday, December 11th, 2001. He reminded them of the timeline the prosecution had attached to the disposal and burning, beginning on Friday, November 30th, 2001, and running up to Friday, April 26th, 2002, the day the torso was found. He reminded them of the words that had been spoken in a flat and the words that were said to have been spoken later in a cell. He reminded them they must be sure. They left the room, and they were not gone long. On Wednesday, April 9th, 2003, after about 4 hours, the jurors returned. The foreman spoke. Christopher was guilty of the murder of John Mitchell. He was guilty of the murder of Daniel. He was guilty of attempting to defeat the ends of justice by dismembering a body and hiding what had been done. He was guilty of other charges of attempted murder and of serious assaults and extortion. Andrew was guilty in relation to Daniel's death and the acts that followed. The judge used a single word to describe the acts as he stood to sentence: barbarous. He said the background was a drug-dealing partnership in which Christopher was the main man. He said when people failed to pay or offended him, they were punished. He spoke about the earlier stabbing of John Mitchell in the leg and about the day of torture. He spoke about the drive to a high bridge and about the fall and the leaving of a man to die. He spoke about the bath in Ibrox and about the hack saw and the rubber gloves and the cable ties. He spoke about the oil drum in the back garden and about the days spent tending a fire. He spoke about ashes emptied and bagged. He said people would be horrified to hear of such acts being committed in their midst. The courtroom did not take the words in silence. Daniel's mother, Lorraine O'Connor, moved toward the dock and had to be held as she spoke to the man who had killed her son. She had a photograph in her hands. There were shouts from other corners, and the court had to be adjourned. Later she spoke outside and said that justice had been done, and that if the law could go further, she would have asked it to. Some said Christopher smiled when the words were said. Some said he applauded as he was taken below. There were reports he had struck at Andrew in the stair when they were taken down to the cells, angered by the testimony that had put the weight on his shoulders. Andrew's family yelled his innocence in the hallway and were moved outside. The sentences were read, step by step. Christopher was given 2 life terms and ordered to serve a minimum of 25 years before parole would be considered. The court also listed further terms for other offences: 10 years for attempting to defeat the ends of justice and 15 years for a run of 8 offences of assault, extortion and attempted robbery, all to run at the same time as the life sentence. Andrew was given life in a young offenders institution and told he must serve at least 17 years for the murder of Daniel. He received 10 years for attempting to defeat the ends of justice and 7 years for other charges, all to run at the same time. Those numbers fixed the future in a way that headlines could hold. The press printed other things that gave the case its edge in the public mind. They wrote that Christopher saw himself as a godfather in Clydebank in Glasgow, that he had threatened to Daniel anyone who got in his way, that he used fear and intimidation to collect payments. They wrote that he liked the way actors looked when they held a stare, that he spent hours watching Goodfellas and The Godfather series and a film called Gangster No. 1, that he practiced the cold look of a performance and tried it on in mirrors. They wrote about a holiday snapshot from July 2001, a cruise ship in Gran Canaria, a woman smiling as he put an arm around her shoulders. She left him later because of violence. They wrote about the head of a cousin on a mantle as a threat and a boast, and they wrote that it was later put into the drum and burned, and that it was never found. They wrote that the limbs were never recovered, and that the remains were scattered at 4 locations, under the Erskine Bridge on the River Clyde, and in skips around the west. They wrote that some parts of the story had to be taken from the mouths of people who had sat in rooms and listened, and then told police, and that those mouths gave testimony in court, and bore the weight of being believed or not believed. The man at the center of it all spoke, once in a way that people could hear. In an interview clip that circulated later, he was asked how 2 people died. He said one fell off a bridge, and the other choked. He was asked if he had been there when the man fell. He said yes. He was asked again, and he said the words again, he fell. He was asked if he thought about it now. He said no, not really. He was asked what he was. He said he was a small-time dealer. The short answers told a story that none of his friends felt able to tell him straight. Those words were quoted next to photographs in which he held that same stare he had learned in a mirror. Prison Life wrote another chapter in tabloid pages. In one story, in a jail in Lanarkshire, a strongman contest was planned, and some men looked bigger and angrier than they should have been. Guards asked for drug tests, and some men refused. A phone would ring in a newsroom, and someone would say that books came to the gate soaked in something that could not be seen by a scanner, and that pages were torn out and eaten. A name that had been printed in a trial was printed again. The same paper ran a story years later, on Monday, December 19, 2016, that said Christopher, then 36 and jailed at Shotts, had offered a 4-figure sum, for £1,000 or an ounce of heroin, to have Andrew taken out because Andrew had testified. A spokesman for the prison service gave the sentence that always follows those stories: "We do not comment on individual prisoners." Another paper wrote that Andrew had been slashed in 2010 and that it was part of a vendetta that had begun in a courtroom. These later stories run on sources who will not put their names on the line. They may be true, they may be half true, they may be jail talk that grows as it is told. They belong to the case because they show a life that went on after a sentence was read, and a circle of fear that did not end at the prison gate. There was also a claim that Christopher had written to a man whose name had been in the papers in another terrible case, a killer named William Beggs, to boast that his murders were better. Boasting is a way men like that measure themselves when they have nothing else to hold on to. If he wrote the letter, he wrote it to be read and to be repeated. The world outside moved on. The law is simple in the end. A jury decided that on 2 occasions in the second half of 2001 Christopher Hutcheson killed men who could not defend themselves. It decided he then took steps to cut up a body and to burn the parts and to scatter what was left. It decided that Andrew Ferguson acted with him in the killing of Daniel and in the steps that followed. A judge gave life sentences and minimum terms that would keep both men inside for decades. The rest is the human part that a courtroom cannot settle. Why does a cousin call another cousin to a flat and ask him to kneel? Why does a young man sit in an armchair and watch? Why do neighbors stay on their side of the street when a man asks for help? The answers in a courtroom are formed in charges and verdicts and sentences. The answers outside are made from people saying fear and shame and grief. The last lines of this story belong to the men who died and to the people who loved them. John Mitchell's life was not a lesson that needed to be taught. He was a man who owed money and who suffered for it, and who died far from help on a bridge on a September night. Daniel Hutcheson's life included service in uniform, and then it included drugs and debt, and the mistake of trusting a family door. His torso was found by 2 men out with dogs on a Friday in April. His head and limbs were never found. His mother stood in a courtroom and spoke from a place beyond words. Years later, her words are the ones that still make sense. A community listened to a judge use the word barbarous. The word is blunt and cold, and sometimes that is the only way to say what was done. The city will remember a bath, a drum, a bridge, a river, and a shopping trip that made the ordinary look like a set of tools for erasing a life. It will remember that a jury sat, and that a foreman stood, and that a life sentence was read. And it will remember what it feels like to live in a place where fear can walk in daylight and call itself by another name. Psychologist Jerry M. Berger set out to answer a simple question. Would ordinary people still obey harmful orders today, the way they did in the famous Yale experiments? He ran a careful partial replication of the obedience study. Participants thought they were delivering electric shocks in a lab. The procedure stopped early for safety at the 150-volt point. That point matters because most people who crossed it in the original work kept going. The result? Obedience levels were only slightly lower than the historic findings. Men and women obeyed at similar rates. Even seeing another person refuse did not reliably break the pull of authority. A few traits helped. Higher empathic concern and a strong desire for control nudged people towards stopping. But the big picture stayed the same. Under pressure from a confident authority, many people keep going. That is the uncomfortable lesson. Not about monsters. About situations that make compliance feel safer than resistance. Now the case. A flat in Ibrox. A circle ruled by fear. A teenager who says he obeyed. A witness who says he froze. Berger's finding does not excuse crimes. It does explain how fear, status, and pressure can push people past the line. Remember the names we lost. John Mitchell. Daniel Hutcheson. If this research gives us anything useful, it is a warning. Build systems that protect witnesses, that break coercion, and that lower the pull of violent authority before it takes another life. If you found value in this episode, please like, subscribe, and share. It helps these stories reach the people who need to hear them.
And no regrets, no remorse.
Not really, I don't really think about it now. Just something happened, didn't it?
So what were you, an enforcer? Or just a kind of a tough drug dealer?
Just a small-time drug dealer, wasn't it? Just didn't take.